Before I tell you what happened at that outpost, I need to make something very clear. We were not afraid of wolves. We were trained soldiers, 112 of us, armed, disciplined, conditioned to function in temperatures that could freeze exposed skin in under 5 minutes. The winter of 1903 was brutal, but it was not our enemy. What hunted us did not begin with howling. It began with silence. The kind of silence that makes you realize the wind has stopped, the trees have stopped, and even your own breath sounds too loud inside your skull. The first man did not die screaming. He died standing. We found him upright in the snow behind the barracks, rifle still in his hands, eyes open, throat intact, body untouched, except for the footprints around him. There were no tracks leading toward him, only tracks leading away. If you are listening right now and you think this will be another campfire monster story, leave. But if you want to know why 17 surviving soldiers signed a report that was sealed for 100 years, then stay, subscribe, and do not look away when I tell you what we saw moving between the white trees. My name is Gilbert Evans, and I did not believe in werewolves until the night one stood on 2 legs outside my window and smiled. When I try to remember the exact moment everything changed at Fort Kearny Outpost in the winter of 1903, I find that my mind does not return to the first body or the first scream, but to something far more subtle and far more disturbing, which was the night the snow began to move in ways that no wind could justify. Our outpost was built along a ridge of frozen earth, overlooking an endless white expanse that swallowed sound and depth alike. And during the long polar nights, the horizon dissolved into a suffocating blur where sky and land merged into one endless sheet of pale oblivion, making it impossible to judge distance and dangerously easy to imagine shapes where there were none. We were 112 men stationed there under strict command, isolated beyond reasonable relief, hardened by routine and repetition, trained to distrust fear and to treat imagination as weakness. It began during the 3rd week of January, when the temperature dropped so violently that the oil in our rifles thickened and the hinges of the supply shed shrieked whenever opened. And it was on one of those nights, long after the lamps had been extinguished and the barracks lay under the heavy silence of sleeping men, that I found myself unable to rest because something felt misaligned, as though the rhythm of the world outside our wooden walls had shifted by a fraction too small to measure yet too large to ignore. I rose from my bunk and approached the frost-coated window beside my cot, wiping a circle clear with the back of my sleeve so I could peer into the white darkness beyond. And at first, I saw nothing but drifting powder illuminated faintly by the distant watchtower lantern. Yet as my eyes adjusted, I noticed an irregularity in the snowfield beyond the fence, a slow indentation forming and reforming, as though an invisible weight pressed down and then lifted again with deliberate care. There was no storm that night, no gusts, no patrol crossing the perimeter. The snow was compressing in a measured line parallel to the barracks, as if something heavy were walking just beyond the edge of perception, careful enough to remain unseen but careless enough to leave the earth altered in its wake. I remember feeling no immediate terror, only confusion threaded with irritation, because discipline demands explanation, and I was determined to find one. So I dressed and stepped outside under the pretense of relieving myself, allowing the cold to carve into my lungs as I circled the building and approached the area where I believed the disturbance had occurred. The ground was pristine, untouched, unmarked, and yet the snow beyond the fence bore depressions too deep and too evenly spaced to belong to drifting powder, impressions that suggested mass and rhythm. But each indentation faded at the edges as though the shape itself resisted definition, leaving me with the unsettling sensation that I was studying the absence of something rather than its presence. I returned to my bunk that night telling myself that fatigue had distorted my vision, that isolation was pressing on my senses, and that nothing living could move across snow without leaving honest tracks behind. I was wrong, because the following morning we discovered that one of our sentries, Corporal Hail, had not returned from his scheduled rotation, and when we found him beyond the east perimeter fence, he was not torn apart or visibly mauled as one might expect from a wild predator, but standing upright against a drift of snow, eyes frozen open toward the horizon, his rifle still clasped in gloved hands, his body perfectly intact except for the unmistakable expression of recognition on his face, as if in the final seconds of his life he had understood precisely what stood before him. There were tracks around him, not approaching, only circling, and leading away. After Corporal Hail's death was officially recorded as exposure and shock, a conclusion that satisfied command far more than any alternative would have. A tension settled over the outpost that no amount of drills or routine could dissolve, because while discipline can suppress panic, it cannot extinguish doubt. And doubt is a far more corrosive force than fear. The men began sleeping in pairs without admitting the reason for doing so, and conversations that once revolved around rations and rotation schedules shifted toward uneasy speculation about wolves migrating earlier than expected. Though no carcasses had been found and no howls had echoed across the valley, which was perhaps the most disturbing element of all, for predators that hunt openly make noise, and noise provides comfort through predictability. What stalked our perimeter made none. On the 5th night after Hale's body was recovered, I volunteered for watch duty in an effort to steady myself, convincing both my commanding officer and my own conscience that vigilance would restore rational order to a situation increasingly governed by rumor and restless imagination, and I took my post along the northern fence, where the lantern light failed to reach the deeper drifts, leaving long corridors of shadow that seemed to pulse gently with shifting frost. Hours passed without incident, until the moment I felt the unmistakable sensation of being observed, not in the vague poetic sense that lonely men describe, but in the precise physical way one feels heat against the back of the neck or pressure behind the eyes, as though attention itself had weight, and that weight was focused entirely upon me. I scanned the ridgeline slowly, forcing my breathing to remain even, and that was when I saw it. At first I believed it to be a man standing beyond the outer tree line, because its silhouette was upright and broad-shouldered, its posture balanced and deliberate, but no human figure should have been that tall, nor should it have stood so motionless in temperatures that numbed exposed skin within minutes, and as I narrowed my gaze, I noticed that its proportions were subtly incorrect, the arms slightly longer than natural, the neck angled in a way that suggested flexibility beyond human design. It did not crouch. It did not crawl. It walked forward on 2 legs with measured control, each step pressing deep into the snow while its upper body remained eerily still. And when it reached the open field between the trees and our fence, it stopped and tilted its head, as though studying me with curiosity rather than hunger. There was fur along its shoulders, but its stance was not animal. There was mass in its frame, but its movement was not clumsy. And when the lantern light caught its face for a single suspended moment, I saw eyes that reflected not like a beast startled in the dark, but like a mind calculating distance. I raised my rifle. It did not flee. Instead, it shifted its weight slightly, as if amused by the gesture, and then turned its back to me with slow, deliberate confidence before walking into the darkness without haste, leaving behind a trail of tracks that were neither fully paw nor fully boot, impressions too elongated and too structured to belong to any creature cataloged in the manuals we studied. I did not fire, and that decision would haunt me long after the snow melted, because that was the night I understood we were not dealing with a starving animal driven by instinct. We were being studied, and whatever studied us had chosen to reveal itself only enough to confirm that it could approach our fortified perimeter without resistance, observe a trained soldier at close range, and depart without consequence. That was when the men stopped laughing at the word werewolf and started whispering it instead. If there is one thing more dangerous than an unseen predator, it is the moment trained men begin questioning the evidence of their own senses, because once doubt infects discipline, it spreads quietly, turning structure into suspicion and brotherhood into something brittle that cracks under the smallest pressure. After I reported what I had seen beyond the northern fence, the commanding officer did not accuse me of lying, but he did something far more damaging, which was to listen in silence and then inform me that exhaustion and isolation were known to produce vivid distortions of perception, especially in environments where the mind is deprived of variation and warmth for extended periods of time. His tone was measured, controlled, professional, and yet beneath it I sensed relief, as though dismissing my sighting restored order in a way acknowledging it never could. The men, however, reacted differently. They watched me, not with mockery, but with hunger for confirmation. Private Leland approached me later that evening near the supply shed, his breath rising in thick white plumes as he spoke in a voice barely above a whisper, and he asked me not what I had seen, but whether it had looked at me directly, because 2 nights earlier he had felt something watching him from the tree line and had convinced himself that fear was inventing eyes where none existed. He described the same height, the same unnatural stillness, the same slow tilt of the head. By the end of that conversation, I realized something far more terrifying than my own encounter, which was that the thing beyond our perimeter was not stalking randomly, but presenting itself selectively, appearing at the edge of perception to different men on different nights, allowing just enough clarity to fracture certainty while withholding enough detail to preserve plausible denial. Within a week, sleep became scarce, not because of noise, but because of anticipation. Men who had marched through artillery fire without hesitation now lay awake, listening for a rhythm in the snow that did not belong to the wind. Conversations at mess were shorter. Laughter felt forced. Even the dogs refused to face the northern ridge after dusk, their ears flattened, their bodies trembling with a fear no training could override. And then it happened again. Sergeant Whitaker vanished during a routine perimeter check that lasted less than 20 minutes. When his absence was discovered, we found no blood, no torn fabric, no sign of struggle, only a line of tracks leading from the fence into the open field, and beside them another set that mirrored his stride for several yards before diverging sharply toward the trees. Those secondary tracks were longer, deeper, and unnervingly precise, as if something had walked beside him deliberately, matching his pace before guiding him away from safety. I need you to think about that for a moment. If you were walking alone at night and sensed something keeping perfect step with you just beyond your vision, would you turn to confront it, or would you pretend not to notice and pray it loses interest? Tell me honestly in the comments what you would have done in Whitaker's place, because I still do not know whether courage or denial would have saved him. We searched until dawn. We found nothing. But that night the snow did not move randomly. It moved in patterns, and those patterns began circling the barracks itself. By the time the 4th disappearance occurred, the official language had shifted from exposure to desertion, which was an insult so hollow that even the officers stopped repeating it aloud, because no man would voluntarily walk into that white emptiness without provisions, and certainly not in the direction of tracks that dwarfed his own. We reinforced the fence. We doubled the watch. We positioned lanterns along the northern approach in an effort to deny shadow its cover, and for 2 nights the perimeter remained undisturbed, which almost restored confidence until the 3rd night, when the dogs began howling in a tone so strained and desperate that it cut through the barracks walls like a blade. I was on interior rotation when the first shout erupted from outside, followed by a sound I will never forget, which was not a growl and not a scream, but the splintering crack of reinforced timber snapping under immense pressure. When I reached the courtyard, I saw the fence bowed inward, one post uprooted entirely from the frozen ground, and beyond it, standing within the lantern light as if stepping onto a stage, was the creature I had glimpsed days before. Only now, there was no distance to soften its details. It stood taller than any man present, its shoulders layered with coarse dark fur that shifted in the wind like a living cloak, yet its torso held upright with a balance too refined for an animal. Its legs were powerful and elongated, bent slightly at the joint as though engineered for both sprinting and sustained pursuit. and its hands ended not in blunt paws but in elongated digits tipped with curved claws that flexed with unsettling control. Its face was the most disturbing aspect of all. The jaw extended forward in a wolf-like structure, yet the eyes sat deep within a skull that carried unmistakably human proportions. And when those eyes moved across us, they did so with calculation, assessing distance, reaction time, threat level. No frenzy, no blind aggression, only awareness. One of the younger soldiers fired without command, the rifle blast shattering the fragile stillness, and the bullet struck the creature's shoulder with visible impact. Yet instead of collapsing, it staggered only slightly before straightening again, lowering its head and releasing a sound that vibrated through my chest rather than my ears. It was not howling at the moon. It was responding to us. Then it moved, not in a chaotic charge, but in a controlled acceleration that closed the distance between fence and barracks in seconds, swiping one man aside with such force that he struck the wooden wall and did not rise again. The rest of us fired in unison. Muzzle flashes illuminated fur, muscle, teeth, and for a single suspended instant as it turned toward me through the gun smoke, I saw something that chilled me more than the blood on the snow. Recognition. It knew me, and it was choosing its targets. When it finally withdrew beyond the shattered fence, it did so not as a defeated animal fleeing injury, but as something that had tested our defenses and found them insufficient. That was the night the word werewolf stopped being whispered and became the only explanation left standing. After the creature crossed the fence and left one of our own broken against the barracks wall like discarded equipment, Command made the only decision it believed remained rational, which was to bring every surviving man inside the central structure before dusk, seal the doors with reinforced timber beams, and position armed rotation posts at every window under the assumption that whatever hunted us preferred the perimeter and would hesitate to force entry through concentrated resistance. That assumption lasted less than one night. The wind that evening was almost non-existent, and the temperature had fallen so sharply that breath crystallized mid-air before vanishing, creating an unnatural clarity in the silence that pressed against the walls of the building, as though the world itself were listening, waiting for something to happen. Inside, 100 men occupied a space built for half that number, boots lined along the interior wall, rifles stacked within arm's reach, eyes scanning shadows that shifted with the flicker of lantern flame, and though no one spoke openly about fear, it saturated the air with a thickness that made every breath feel borrowed. I was stationed near the southern corridor when the first sign occurred, which was not a sound of impact or splintering wood, but a slow dragging noise above us, deliberate and measured, as though something heavy were moving across the roof in patient observation of our movements below. Several men glanced upward instinctively, and for a moment we convinced ourselves that drifting ice or shifting frost might produce such a sound. Yet the rhythm continued in an unmistakable pattern, paced footsteps crossing from one end of the building to the other with controlled precision. Then came the scratching. Not frantic clawing, not a desperate attempt to tear through, but a steady testing of the structure. Long curved pressure sliding along the grain of the timber, as if mapping weaknesses, tracing seams, memorizing resistance points. One of the men began praying under his breath. Another tightened his grip so violently on his rifle that the metal creaked. I remember locking eyes with Lieutenant Crawford across the room and seeing in his expression the collapse of command authority. Because discipline can organize men against gunfire, but it cannot instruct them how to respond when something stands above their shelter studying its architecture. The roof beams groaned. Snow cascaded down through small fractures between planks, and then, without warning, a section of the ceiling collapsed inward under immense force, splintering apart in a shower of wood and frost as the creature dropped directly into the center of the barracks with a weight that shook the entire structure. There was no hesitation in its movement. It landed upright, balanced, eyes adjusting instantly to lantern light, and for the first time we saw the full scale of it at close range. towering above us with muscle layered beneath thick fur that glistened faintly with frozen condensation, its chest expanding in slow, controlled breaths rather than wild panting. Gunfire erupted from every direction. The confined space amplified the sound to a deafening roar. Yet even as bullets struck its torso and limbs, it advanced through the chaos with terrifying purpose, swiping one man aside, seizing another by the shoulder and lifting him with effortless strength before hurling him across the room like an object rather than a human body. Blood struck the walls, lanterns shattered, smoke thickened, and through it all the creature moved not like a mindless predator, but like a strategist dismantling resistance piece by piece, targeting those closest to exits, cutting off retreat with calculated efficiency. When it finally withdrew back through the ruptured ceiling, carrying one soldier in its grasp as though claiming proof of dominance, it left behind not just casualties, but something far more destructive, which was certainty. It could breach our shelter, it could withstand our bullets, and it could choose when to leave. That night, we stopped believing survival depended on defense. We began to suspect it depended on selection. The morning after the barracks assault revealed damage beyond structural ruin, because what lingered in the aftermath was not simply blood and broken timber, but a pervasive awareness that the creature's actions followed an evolving pattern, one that no longer resembled random predation but deliberate pressure applied over time. We counted the dead. We treated the wounded. We inventoried ammunition and discovered with mounting dread that nearly 1/4 of our supply had been expended in less than 10 minutes. And yet the only evidence of injury we could confirm was a thin, dark trail of frozen blood beyond the northern tree line, suggesting that while our gunfire had caused damage, it had not inflicted fatal harm. That realization shifted something fundamental within the ranks. If it could bleed and continue advancing, then pain did not deter it. If it could retreat while injured, then it possessed restraint, and restraint implies cognition. By midday, rumors spread that some of the men had begun hearing voices at night, low guttural murmurs carried through the wind in tones disturbingly close to human speech, though none could repeat distinct words, only fragments of sound that hovered at the edge of recognition before dissolving into breath and frost. I did not believe those reports until I experienced it myself. On the second night after the breach, while posted near the interior staircase leading to the storage cellar, I heard my own name spoken from beyond the outer wall, not shouted or distorted, but whispered in a voice roughened by depth rather than language, elongated slightly, as though the speaker were testing pronunciation. Gilbert. The syllables vibrated through the timber with such clarity that I felt them in my spine. I told myself exhaustion was manufacturing hallucination, yet the voice returned minutes later, closer this time, followed by a slow, deliberate knock against the wall at shoulder height, measured and spaced evenly, as if mimicking human behavior. Several others heard it too, not their own names, but words. Simpleones, open, come, cold. It was not hungry for flesh alone. It was probing the boundary between instinct and intellect, experimenting with communication in a way that shattered the final illusion separating it from us. By the end of that week, fewer than 70 men remained alive, and those who survived had begun avoiding eye contact, not out of shame or weakness, but from a creeping suspicion that the creature's study of us had advanced beyond observation, that perhaps it was not only learning our movements, but absorbing something deeper, our speech, our fear, our patterns. The question that began circulating quietly through the barracks was no longer whether it was a werewolf. It was whether it had once been one of us. And if that were true, then the hunger driving it might not end with the body. It might be for something far more permanent. And that was when I began to understand that the snow was not merely hiding tracks. It was erasing evidence of transformation. By the time our numbers had fallen below 60, the silence inside the barracks had grown more oppressive than the storms outside, because silence no longer signified safety but concealment, and every man had begun listening not only for movement beyond the walls, but for irregular breathing within them. It was Private Leland who first drew attention, though not because of any dramatic outburst or violent behavior, but because of a gradual alteration so subtle that at first it felt cruel to mention, as though suspicion itself were a betrayal greater than the threat stalking us. His wounds from the earlier skirmish had been superficial. A deep laceration across the shoulder where the creature's claws had torn through fabric and flesh, yet the injury healed with unnatural speed, sealing in days rather than weeks, leaving behind skin that appeared thicker and slightly darker than before, as if layered over something resisting exposure. He stopped sleeping, not in the restless pacing manner of frightened men, but in stillness, seated upright against the wall for hours without blinking, eyes fixed toward the northern corridor where frost collected thickest along the boards, and when spoken to he responded half a second too late, as though translating language internally before releasing it again. One evening, as the lantern light flickered low and the temperature inside the barracks dropped enough for breath to fog faintly in the air, I noticed Leland inhaling deeply near the open doorway, nostrils flaring almost imperceptibly, head tilting with the same measured angle I had seen beyond the fence days earlier. And in that moment, a realization struck me with such force that my pulse thundered in my ears. He was not smelling the cold. He was scenting the man. Whispers spread quickly once the observation was voiced, and though none dared accuse him openly, the air around him grew tense, conversations halting whenever he approached, hands shifting closer to rifle stocks without conscious command. When confronted gently by Lieutenant Crawford about his condition, Leland smiled in a way that did not match the gravity of our situation, lips stretching slightly wider than comfort allowed, and he insisted he felt stronger than ever, more alert, more aware of subtle vibrations in the building, claiming he could hear movements beneath the floorboards that the rest of us dismissed as settling timber. That night the wind returned violently, striking the walls with sharp bursts of ice, and in the chaos of noise we heard a howl unlike any before, deeper and closer, reverberating not from the tree line but from somewhere near the southern edge of the compound. Every man froze, because the sound carried dual tones layered together, one raw and animalistic, the other almost harmonic, as though two throats were producing a single call. Leland stood. He did not appear startled. He appeared attentive, and when the second howl answered from beyond the perimeter, identical in pitch and cadence, his lips parted slightly as if resisting the urge to respond. The room shifted from fear to something far worse, which was recognition. No one spoke the accusation aloud, yet we all felt it coiling between us, heavy and suffocating. The possibility that whatever stalked the snow was not merely studying us from the outside, but altering us from within, reshaping flesh and instinct until the line between hunter and hunted dissolved completely. When Leland's eyes met mine across the dim room, I saw in them not confusion, not pain, but comprehension, and something else: invitation. The decision to restrain Leland was not made through vote or command, but through collective instinct, because when men have been pushed beyond the boundaries of rational explanation, they begin acting according to survival impulses that override hierarchy, and survival in that moment demanded certainty, even if certainty required cruelty. We secured him in the storage cellar beneath the barracks, binding his wrists and ankles with reinforced cord, while he offered no resistance, which disturbed us more than struggle would have, because compliance suggested awareness of inevitability rather than innocence. The cellar was cold and narrow, lined with stacked crates and ration barrels, its ceiling low enough that most men had to stoop, and we positioned 2 guards outside the door while the rest of us remained above in strained vigilance, waiting for either confirmation of transformation or proof of our own descent into paranoia. Hours passed without incident. Then the temperature dropped abruptly, far beyond the normal fluctuation of winter night, so sharply that frost formed along the interior walls despite the lanterns burning at full capacity. From below came a sound, not chain straining, not a scream, but the deliberate shifting of bone. It began as a series of muted cracks, slow and rhythmic, as though joints were being dislocated and reset with patient force, followed by a low exhale that lengthened unnaturally, stretching beyond human lung capacity before tapering into a guttural resonance that vibrated through the floorboards. One of the guards opened the cellar door against orders, driven by a mixture of horror and disbelief, and what we saw within that confined space is something I struggle to articulate without feeling the air leave my chest even now. Leland's body had elongated beyond its natural proportions, spine arched and shoulders expanded against the ropes that had snapped under pressure, skin splitting along the healed wound at his shoulder, as coarse dark fur erupted through the tear, like something pushing outward from beneath the surface rather than growing from it. His jaw had shifted forward, teeth extending, gums retracting with wet audible tension, yet his eyes remained unmistakably human, wide and aware, darting between us with recognition as though pleading and condemning simultaneously. The transformation was not instantaneous, nor was it cinematic. It was violent, biological, invasive, as though something dormant within him had waited patiently for the correct threshold of stress and fear before claiming dominance. When he lunged upward, the force of his movement shattered the remaining bindings and drove his head into the low ceiling, splintering wood, and the sound that erupted from his throat was no longer divided into dual tones. It was singular, complete, and answered immediately from beyond the outer walls. The second howl was closer than ever before. In that instant, the truth crystallized with merciless clarity. The creature beyond our fence had not been hunting us for sustenance alone. It had been cultivating continuity. As Leland surged forward and the guards fired in blind panic within the confined cellar, blood spraying across ration crates and stone floor alike, I understood that the outpost was no longer under siege by a solitary predator. We were witnessing multiplication. And the snow outside, pristine and endless, was waiting to conceal the tracks of whatever emerged next. After Leland's transformation tore the final illusion of control from our hands, the outpost ceased functioning as a military installation and became instead a structure trembling under the weight of inevitability. Because once one man changes before your eyes, every heartbeat in the room becomes suspect. Gunfire in the cellar echoed upward through the floorboards with chaotic intensity. Yet even before the smoke settled, we heard the answering howl from beyond the shattered fence, closer than ever before, layered now with an undercurrent that felt almost anticipatory, as if something outside had been waiting not for our surrender, but for confirmation. Leland, or what remained of him, broke through the cellar door in a violent surge of splintered timber and blood, his body now fully overtaken by the grotesque symmetry of wolf and man fused into a single towering frame, muscles coiled beneath matted fur, elongated limbs ending in claws that carved deep gouges into the wood as he pulled himself into the corridor with horrifying strength. His eyes found me instantly, not randomly, not in confusion, but with memory. There was still recognition within them, buried beneath instinct. And that recognition carried something far more disturbing than rage. It carried allegiance. Before we could regroup, the outer wall of the barracks exploded inward under a force too immense to be human, and through the avalanche of snow and shattered planks stepped the original creature, larger, broader, its fur streaked dark with dried blood, its posture relaxed as if entering territory it already owned. Two of them now stood within the barracks. One born, one made. The surviving men fired until their rifles clicked empty, muzzle flashes illuminating fur, bone, and tearing flesh. Yet bullets seemed only to slow their advance rather than halt it, and within minutes, the interior of the building dissolved into screams, collapsing beams, and the sickening sound of bone yielding under crushing force. The creatures moved in coordinated arcs, cutting off escape routes, herding rather than chasing, driving men toward the southern wall where snowdrifts piled high enough to trap the desperate in waist-deep frost before dragging them back into shadow. I do not remember every detail of that night because terror fractures memory into disjointed fragments, but I remember the smell of iron thick in the air, the heat of blood against frozen skin, and the realization that the original creature was not simply killing, it was overseeing. When the storm intensified near dawn, wind screaming across the ridge and erasing every visible trace of struggle, the outpost was no longer a structure but a carcass split open, its walls collapsed inward, lantern light extinguished, human voices silenced. I survived only because I was buried beneath debris and snow, pinned under shattered timber that concealed my movement and masked my scent long enough for the creatures to retreat beyond the ridge. When I clawed my way free hours later, the white expanse around Fort Kearny was unbroken except for a single trail of massive tracks leading north. 2 sets at first, then many. I walked for 2 days through terrain that did not forgive weakness, surviving on melted snow and the instinct to place one foot ahead of the other, my rifle empty, my hands numb beyond sensation. Yet what haunted me most was not the carnage left behind, but the pattern of tracks I had seen stretching toward the tree line. They multiplied. At irregular intervals along the snowfield, new impressions branched from the original path, smaller at first, uneven, as though something recently changed was still adjusting to unfamiliar proportions, yet each set gradually stabilized into the same elongated stride that had circled Corporal Hail weeks earlier. The transformation did not end with Leland. It spread. By the time I reached the nearest supply rail station and collapsed at its threshold, I had counted at least 7 distinct trails, merging toward the northern forest, and though exposure and dehydration blurred the edges of my perception, I remained certain of one final detail. They were not running. They were walking, measured, organized, as if relocating. The official inquiry that followed dismissed my testimony as trauma-induced hysteria, attributing the destruction of the outpost to structural collapse during a storm and the disappearance of personnel to disorientation and frostbite, sealing the report under classification for reasons I was never permitted to read. But I know what I saw. I know what I heard outside my window before the first man died standing. And I know that whatever began at Fort Kearny in 1903 did not remain there, because 2 weeks after my release from medical observation, while confined to a hospital ward miles from any forest, I woke in the middle of the night to the sound of deliberate pacing outside the building, slow, heavy, measured, followed by a knock at shoulder height against the outer brick wall. 3 times. Even now, years later, I sometimes wake to that same rhythm in my dreams, and I cannot shake the certainty that the original creature did not attack our outpost out of hunger or territory. It was recruiting, and I was spared. You have just heard the testimony of Gilbert Evans, one of 17 recorded survivors of the 1903 Fort Kearny disaster. Though official documents claim no such incident occurred, and no outpost by that name was ever destroyed under classified circumstances. If you believe trained soldiers can vanish in snowstorms without explanation, then perhaps this was only tragedy layered over paranoia. But if you have ever felt something watching you from beyond the reach of light, if you have ever heard footsteps pacing where no patrol should be, then you understand that some predators do not hunt with frenzy. They hunt with patience. Tell me in the comments what you think truly happened at that outpost. Because the most disturbing detail is not the bodies that were lost. It is the tracks that walked away. And if you hear 3 deliberate knocks somewhere in the night after this video ends, do not assume it is the wind. Listen to the rhythm. Because in 1903, the snow did not hide a monster. It marked the beginning of a migration.